I wanted to talk about the NIH NeuroAI conference. The NIH has video casts of all their meetings here. So this is the advisory board from August 2023. So they have all these up. So we'll start here. This is the website here where they talk about the Brain Initiative. So the NeuroAI Workshop is kind of growing out of this Brain Initiative. The NIH has sponsored this. This is 10 years of brain, a decade of innovation. This is the Brain Research Through Advancing Innovative Neurotechnologies Initiative. And the shorthand for that is BRAIN. So that's great. It's one of those acronyms they have to kind of fit or shoehorn into the acronym. So, but anyways, that's where they're going from. So there are a lot of funding opportunities under BRAIN. One of them being this NeuroAI initiative. So this is a post on Blue Sky. It says Blake Richards, who was a presenter at this workshop. So I'm going to go through this post a little bit, and this is kind of pointing to his presentation that he gave. So he says, I work in NeuroAI, a growing field of research, which many people have only the haziest conception of. As way of introduction to this research approach, I'll provide here a very short thread outlining the definition of the field I gave recently at our Brain NeuroAI workshop at the NIH. So yeah, he was there, he presented, he had some really interesting insights, some interesting, nice looking slides. So this is one of the slides here. The usual answer that people give is that it's research that creates a virtuous cycle between neuroscience and AI. So this is the sort of the view here where you have neuroscience, machine learning, or AI. Machine learning influences neuroscience by interpreting and analyzing data. Neuroscience influences machine learning by inspiring novel solutions. And if that's what was kind of the tenor of this entire workshop, was that you had people who wanted to use machine learning to analyze neuroscience data. You had machine learning people wanted to use neuroscience, or in fact, some computational neuroscientists who wanted to use machine learning, or they wanted to use neuroscience to inspire novel machine learning solutions. And that's the usual meaningless answer, as Blake puts it. So this is the usual answer. Research creates a virtuous cycle between neuroscience and AI. I've given this definition as well in the past, but if forced, I would admit that it's fairly vacuous as a definition. And I think that's true because what's a virtuous cycle? Like we can say that if I employ you and I underpay you for your labor, but I pay you, that's a virtuous cycle, right? It's not a virtuous cycle, but you could make that argument, I guess. But so that's kind of the vacuousness of it. It's just some relationship, and you say it's a virtuous cycle, it just means that they both benefit somehow. But it's hard to see that, like, it seems like there's a difference in scope in terms of these contributions. So being sort of the data analysis appendage of neuroscience is much less beneficial than being able to inspire novel solutions for architectures. So the more practical answer is that it is research that either one, uses artificial neural networks and models at similar levels of abstraction to understand the brain, which we have from we have neuromorphic computing, we have other types of models that just kind of abstract things from the brain and use those as sort of a model of information processing. Or two, uses neuroscience ideas to try to improve the artificial neural networks used in AI. So that's still kind of the same thing, but it's just more concrete, as he points out. It hides the real philosophy. So he gives us practical answer. Research that either one, uses artificial neural networks to model the brain, or two, uses neuro ideas to improve ANNs for AI. And so although this is kind of refining that first vacuous definition, it hides a much deeper disciplinary turn. So I think that the proper definition is that NeuroAI is the realization of the original promise of cybernetics and connectionism. So that's something that we've talked about in this group, and that's kind of our way of viewing NeuroAI. I think that's actually an interesting point. That you have these sort of, you had cybernetics as sort of this thing that was inspired by the brain. It's not AI, but it gives us these models that we can then use maybe for AI, or have it has some computational value. It has some theoretical value. So you could turn around and use it in neuroscience. And it's its own thing. It stands on its own. So, within neuroscience and machine learning, we might insert a card in this diagram that is cybernetics. And cybernetics might, be able to, influence both machine learning and neuroscience. And then there's a feedback to cybernetics. So that's one. And then connectionism, of course, is where we have these kind of networks that are deep learning networks, but they're connectionist networks. And connectionist networks are a broader class of models. So we can use that sort of connectionist philosophy to build all other types of models that are influenced by the brain. So, like if we're talking about synaptic computing, synaptic computing are kind of also connectionist models, because you're connecting from, say, like a set of dendrites to the cell body. You're collecting them, you're summing them, you're performing operations on them. You basically generate a bunch of weights and rules that then you can use to say, this is how this information is processed in a single neuronal unit, and then you have other sets of weights that follow from that. So this is interesting. So cybernetics and connectionism, and there are connections between those two, of course, that we haven't talked about much in the meetings, but this is sort of like our approach, and just put into words. And it's a general science of intelligence focused on parallel distributed systems, control learning. So this card actually talks about that. Rather than continue the battle in cognitive science, we have dropped the endless philosophical debates and grandiose ideas and focused on a progressive research program of science and engineering, because that is what's paid off for us in the end. So again, a general science of intelligence founded on parallel distributed systems, control, and learning. And then finally, obviously disciplinary boundaries are blurry, and I don't want to gatekeep anyone. For example, telling people they're not allowed to color research NeuroAI, which of course is often the case in disciplines. But I personally like this definition and think it provides the appropriate links to the lineage and philosophy of this new field. So this is good. So that's Blake Richards. And then, so that's that. And then let's go to the some of the slides that were presented there. This is the website for the Brain NeuroAI Workshop. This is the agenda. So it was split over 2 days, and they spent a lot of time on these guiding questions. So, they would have like discussion panels every session, morning and afternoon, and they would have these questions up on a slide where you could see them, and, it would kind of lay out the agenda. And of course, there were speakers who did a lot of different talked about a lot of different things. Let's start with on the path forward. So this is a summary of discussion from MPBH. This was a workshop on neuromorphic principles of biomedicine and hardware. So this is a different conference and kind of leading into this one. So this is taking a neuromorphic approach. The first is leveraging the algorithms, size, weight, and power benefits of neuromorphics, but do not be overly prescriptive. And they say that means thinking physiomorphically. In other words, a lot of the issues of size and weight of power of the processors and the hardware can be thought of as a physiological system. And so if you're thinking about neuromorphics, which means you're using the principles of the nervous system at the level not just of connections between cells, but also this deeper hardware part, like the physiology of the brain, then you should be able to model that as, kind of like a physiological system rather than just kind of copying what the brain does in terms of its architecture. The second one is focus on clear clinical needs rather than technology-driven solutions. The third is that, people are interested ultimately in building these implantable, wearable prosthetic devices that will benefit from new materials, architectures, and neuromorphics. Develop better infrastructure for sharing expertise, data, technique, and tools. That's always a thing that people mention. Whether that happens or not is an open question. We'll talk about PsyOps in a minute to kind of drive that home. Development of standard platforms, interfaces, and software. Encourage more interaction between academic research, industry, and clinicians. Develop better frameworks to design and evaluate adaptive systems. Develop and share multimodal data sets from real-world situations. And develop theoretical analysis framework for neuromorphics in biomedicine and healthcare. Again, from this workshop on neuromorphic principles in biomedicine and healthcare, on materials and integration challenges, they make points. There are exciting and exotic materials and architectures being developed that are ideally suited for neuromorphic application. There's this need for new electronic materials that are better matched to tissue. So you have materials that stretch and conform to their surrounding environment. You have materials that are biocompatible. In other words, you don't want to put metal or plastics of different types embed them in the nervous system. You want things that are biocompatible. You want things that can self-heal. You don't want to have to keep fixing things and going in and making sure that they don't, if they break, that you go in and you fix it manually. You want them to heal themselves. Low immune response. You don't want the implants to be rejected. And the ability to interface directly with tissue. So you want them to be able to actually stimulate tissue or do something else, record from tissue, and not be invasive in any way. Then you need need for better tools and standardized approaches for fabricating these new materials into devices, noting that currently each lab must develop their own techniques from scratch. This is on neuromorphic principles. Cautioned against being too precious about strict biological mimicry, suggesting a broader physiomorphic framework. So this is where you don't necessarily want to copy the biological substrate. Like you don't want to copy neocortex. At least in this case, that's what they're suggesting. You want to have a physiomorphic system that sort of behaves like a nervous system, but isn't modeled after any specific nervous system. Which makes sense because if we don't know how the brain works, we can't really replicate the brain and expect it to work. So this is, kind of moving in a direction where we at least have a good appreciation for what we have and how we can control it. Term neuromorphic itself can be problematic in industry and clinical contexts because of perceived immaturity risk, yet AI is accepted. So this is interesting that people have problems with neuromorphic because they don't see it as a mature technology, but AI is likewise an immature technology where people accept that much more freely. I mean, these are just things that they're pointing out. They might be barriers to adoption. They might be things that are needed, etc. Neuromorphic principles often offer valuable approaches, needs to focus on concrete problem solving. So this is where, we can mimic things that are neuromorphic. We can mimic like biological substrates, but we want to be able to solve problems with them, not just replicate them. Talking about benchmarking, this stifles creativity and discovery. Some people disagree, obviously. Benchmarking is needed to get a handle on performance, but thinking always about benchmarking and how things perform at a benchmark can also reduce your ability to make new, novel things. Then key technical advantages of neuromorphic approaches as opposed to standard AI approaches are power efficiency, which is important for, say, like implanted devices, real-time processing capability, the ability to process data with low latency directly at the sensor, natural interfacing with biological systems, speaking the same language as neural tissue, and resilience and adaptability. So, how biologically inspired stochastic processing can provide robustness. It says speaks to sort of the partially stochastic nature of neural activity and being able to leverage that. So this is session 4. I'll just kind of work through these as I pull these out. But so session 1 was Tuesday morning. Session 4 was Wednesday afternoon. This was the session that I just talked about. So again, you're talking about neuromorphics, robotics, intelligent computing. They had some goals and guiding questions. So the goals in this session were to discuss potential future NeuroAI principles and technologies, real-time personalized learning systems with appropriate metrics, and their translation across agencies. So, this is in the NIH, so they have different initiatives like mental health, disease, other types of things, applied research. So, they want to be able to leverage it across what they're doing. Understand how other government agencies or stakeholders could benefit from BRAIN's data sets and knowledge bases, BRAIN being this initiative I just talked about. And the guiding questions are threefold. So the first one is what foundational advances in NeuroAI are needed to enable energy-efficient neuromorphic computing, adaptive robotics, or intelligent neural interfaces with the potential to transform neuroscience and brain health. What kinds of metrics are needed to evaluate progress in both technical capabilities and translational impact? Number 2, what infrastructure and platforms are needed to enable innovative, scalable healthcare technologies that are affordable, secure, and user-friendly? How can BRAIN initiative resources and cross-agency partnerships accelerate this? And then 3, how can NeuroAI approaches and technologies drive reciprocal advances between fundamental neuroscience and transformative health technologies, medicine, AI, and/or robotics, while ensuring ethical use of neural data and meaningful incorporation of clinician-patient perspectives? So let me pull up the goal and guiding questions for session 2. This is exploring the structure and functional convergence of deep neural nets in brains. So this was Tuesday afternoon. The goal of this was to explore how large brain data and computational tools may enable advances in NeuroAI frameworks, theories, models, and metrics. Describing approaches for comparing natural intelligence and brain data with AI models. So this is where, again, we're kind of thinking about NeuroAI, and we're thinking beyond just kind of the frameworks to a lot of these different theories and models and ways you can put them into the world. So the guiding questions are 1, how can we develop and validate metrics for comparing biological and artificial systems that capture meaningful computational principles while avoiding overfitting to specific comparison methods or oversimplifying complex neural dynamics? So this is where we need to kind of create metrics from our NeuroAI system, and how can we make those robust? Question 2, what frameworks and approaches can help identify meaningful comparisons between biological and artificial systems, considering different levels of abstraction from algorithmic principles to physical implementation? Which computational principles in brain systems are more or less difficult for NeuroAI models to capture? So this is where we have, we have to kind of, first of all, think about what are the computational principles in brain systems, and then 2, can we capture them in our models? Question 3, how can brain initiative datasets be effectively leveraged to evaluate and validate theories about shared computational principles while accounting for the different requirements of hypothesis-driven science and large-scale projects to develop NeuroAI models and resources? And then finally, what infrastructure, benchmarks, and standardized platforms will be needed to enable ethically and scientifically rigorous measurements comparing human or animal data to NeuroAI models? The questions for session 1. This is defining NeuroAI for BRAIN, which is this BRAIN initiative, gaps, challenges, and opportunities. This was on Tuesday morning, the first session. So the goal here is to establish a vision for NeuroAI as a convergent framework where neuroscience and AI drive reciprocal advances through shared principles, identify concrete opportunities for brain initiative resources to bridge biological and artificial systems. The guiding questions here: how can brains' large-scale datasets be structured and leveraged to develop NeuroAI resources, such as neural foundation models or digital twins, while balancing the need for both hypothesis-driven science and high-entropy naturalistic data collection? I guess what they mean by that is that you have a lot of, I don't know what they mean by high entropy, but basically where you either a very constrained sort of controlled experiment, where you're testing a hypothesis, or you're just collecting data from the world. I guess that's what they mean. Question 2, how should we expand our understanding of neural computation to incorporate broader biological systems, including glia, neuromodulation, and development or evolutionary perspectives, in ways that inform both theoretical advances and practical NeuroAI implementations? So this is something I think that we're interested in quite a bit, at least the way we talk about things. That's a good question, I think, to kind of unpack maybe in the future. I'm going to make a note of that, actually. All right. Question 3, how can experimental platforms and technologies support a discovery loop that integrates theory development, model validation, hypothesis generation, and data-driven approaches while meaningfully incorporating physical embodiment and real-world behavior? And in question 4, what infrastructure, tools, and coordination mechanisms are needed to enable collection and analysis of naturalistic neural and behavioral data at scales beyond individual laboratories while maintaining rigor and reproducibility? So session 3, this was Wednesday morning, advancing theory for brain through neuromorphic computing, embodiment, and physical intelligence. So this is sort of this embodiment aspect to NeuroAI, which again, this is something we're interested in, but is not like something that is kind of at the fore of a lot of the discussions. And I'm taking another note here. And so the goal here is to create new theories for neuroscience through large-scale neuromorphic computing, neurodesign principles, and complementary models, and incorporate principles of embodiment and physical intelligence. So this is very sort of embodied AI workshop. Question 1, how can neuromorphic approaches help us understand fundamental principles of brain computation while also advancing more efficient artificial systems? What determines whether neuromorphic computing serves primarily as a modeling and simulation platform versus providing emulation of biological processes to achieve deeper theoretical insights into neural computation? Question 2, given the coevolution of hardware and algorithms in both technology and biology, how do we ensure our choice of abstraction level and implementation approach reveals fundamental principles rather than artifacts of available technology? Which biological mechanisms are essential to implement versus those that can be simplified? This is a question of looking at the coevolution of hardware and algorithms and how you abstract that neural system at both levels. Question 3, how can different approaches to physical implementation, from neuromorphic hardware to bio-inspired robotics and physical or in silico model in the loop systems, advance our theoretical understanding of neural computation? What role should embodied approaches or physical interaction play in this NeuroAI discovery? So this is a slide where they kind of get into Brain's definition of NeuroAI for this workshop. So I talked about Blake Richards' definition of NeuroAI and the standard definition of NeuroAI. But what about the Brain definition of NeuroAI? And so that is where we have these 5 points. So the first is NeuroAI leverages convergence between neuroscience and AI to drive reciprocal advances in understanding natural intelligence and AI. Again, this loop, this discovery loop. This workshop seeks to collect broad community input to identify potential future priorities and opportunities for NeuroAI. Workshop participants are encouraged to broadly consider interdisciplinary approaches in NeuroAI that extend to embodiment, neural control of complex behavior, and evolutionary or comparative perspectives. The fourth is the Brain NeuroAI Workshop seeks insight from diverse, related, and adjacent disciplines. So it's embodied cognition, bio-inspired robotics, neuromorphic computing, and more. And then participants should consider what kinds of metrics are needed to enable coordinated advances in NeuroAI. So this is focusing kind of on energy efficiency, some other types of things that kind of build on top of that, and so forth. This is actually interesting. I'll get into the PsyOps paper later, but this is a slide from a talk on PsyOps, and I think we talked about this in one of our meetings already, maybe last week, where it was brought up. I think Morgan brought it up, where there's this idea of, so it's like based on the idea of DevOps. DevOps being like software development and operations management. PsyOps is like scientific, scientific management or scientific development, scientific research and operations management. It's basically this sort of project management for large scientific projects. So this shows kind of the 5 levels of PsyOps maturity. So, we have the initial level, which are ad hoc processes, bespoke development. Level 2 is managed processes or established processes. These are repeatable, role specialization, and quality control. Level 3 is defined or shareable processes, where we have open source ecosystems, fair data standards, which is the findable, accessible, interoperable, and reproducible standards, and fair workflows. Level 4 is scalable, automated workflows. This is the PsyOps pipeline, collaborative environments, and team flow, which just means like workflows and teams. And then level 5 is optimizing, where you have closed loop discovery, where you have AI plus humans in the loop. So this is where you kind of use that to bootstrap new discoveries. This was another discussion on what they call AI versus NI, artificial intelligence versus natural intelligence. So this is kind of the slide where they talk about the differences here. They talk about machine learning models being with a generic regular architecture that has a weak prior. So, this is where we start with a random network. It's fully connected or, has no structure, something that's trained and shaped. And the generic regular architecture is this weak prior. So it doesn't predict things out of the box. It has to build predictions from the training. And he calls this the blob, which means that it's not shaped in any way. And of course, in natural intelligence, we know that, development can shape neural architectures in various ways. There are various aspects of innate abilities or innate structures that are formed. And so we have a starting point that's very different. Then there's this other point, hope to force differentiation emergently through data-intensive, task-specific learning, and that's called shallow adaptation, which is what we have with AI. So we use a lot of data, we kind of shove it down the model's throat. We use task-specific learning, and that's shallow adaptation because it doesn't necessarily generalize, nor does it provide any real insight. It's just a lot of data. So the problems with AI versus natural intelligence. Number 1, the models are task domain specific. The second is going from scratch to complex functionality is hard and data compute intensive. Number 3 is no control over the model that emerges. We get weird models of things. Number 4 is risk of unnatural and abrupt latent failure modes. Again, it's brittleness, it's not robust. And then ML-based views are unlikely to scale well to complex general intelligence. These include, we have multimodal models, but then the ones that are unlikely to scale well are model merging, convergent learning, and the bitter lesson from Sutton. So interesting kind of summary of what those differences are. There was a talk on dendritic computing and dendrites. So, this is kind of like the perspective on what dendrites contribute to computing. This is a paper, Pagkolos et al., Current Opinion in Neurobiology in 2024. So that's the sort of the reference. And they talk about dendrites being like this difference, there being a difference between a point neuron and a dendritic neuron, that the dendrites do a lot of high-end processing that you don't get with like a connectionist model of neurons or units. And then you have this sort of similar performance here. They talk about how dendritic artificial neural networks use a different learning strategy. So dendritic ANN has mixed selective nodes. VANNs are class-specific nodes. So these are differences in the learning strategies of these two different types of networks. And then we have dendrites and artificial intelligence. This just shows some of the things that dendrites can sort of contribute to this area. So you have a dendritic input versus a somatic input. It can do things like multiplexing, credit assignment, and error backpropagation. So there are these different sort of things about what we need. So there are 3 slides in what we need to do, I guess, effective NeuroAI. The first is accessible high fidelity data. So, this speaks to open data and some of the standards and databases that we have, such as Dandy, NeuroData Without Borders, and BIDS. These are all tools that we have. It's nice that we have these things, but it's kind of difficult still to use them in multiple contexts. Plus, people share their own data from their own labs and they fit them into these frameworks. So that's, and then we have small scale data sets that do not differentiate between models. We need more data collected with models in mind, and we need to consider the signal to noise ratio of our data sets. And then we have opportunities for both breadth to build both breadth and depth, breadth being multi-system and multi-domain, depth being causal manipulations and detailed neural activity. So we can sample from a wide range of neural processes or look deeply at one neural process and get the causal aspects of it and the detailed neural activity correct. We need both of those really to do effective NeuroAI. What we need too is comparable model testing. So we don't have to or should not agree on how to build the next best models, but we do need a clear measure of a model delta, which means the difference between 2 models leads to robust improvements. And so we need benchmarks for this. This is where he talks about brain score, which is this competition where they tried to find benchmarks for different, looking at different models and how they compare to, I think it's neuroimaging data, but basically they have this brain score website that he was referencing. And then what we need 3 are models of brain intricacies. So we need to have this sort of breadth and depth. We need a breadth, which is complex cognition. So if we want to think about language, we don't want to just think about the language centers. We want to think about knowledge and reasoning. We, in fact, want to think about the entire language network. And we want to think about things like emotions and social inferences and multimodal processing and all these other things that go into, say, like language. And so instead of just having like some sort of transformer to use in a language model, we want to have these neural systems that are very wide. And then we want to have depth or biological detail. So we want to know where things happen in the brain, what mechanisms are indeed responsible for them. We want to have models of embodiment and biophysics. So we want to have all of this biological detail as well. So one of our goals in NeuroAI, and I thought this was interesting, was where we're trying to understand the emergent phenomena in biological brains. So it means that, we have, of course, this emergent phenomena in brains. We have things like population activity and plasticity rules that kind of grow out of the representation we use for the brain. And of course, we know that different neurons will, contribute to these collective representations that we can then use. So our models of current AI are based on sort of the computational principles of brains. representation, but we know that that's, kind of built from parts, from neural activity. And so there's this emergent aspect that we need to capture better. And so, we have all these different modalities and tasks and different things happening at the neural level, and somehow that builds a representation that we then use. In AI, we just simply use that representation and don't worry so much about the details. But NeuroAI, we want to understand those details. And perhaps that helps us to refine our representation. So there was a lot of talk about dendrites. This is Hobena Bawahan, who's done a lot of neuromorphic computing work. And he has this paper, Dendrocentric Learning for Synthetic Intelligence. So this is a good paper where it talks a lot about sort of the neuromorphic aspect of synthetic intelligence, how you can kind of work on both this aspect of being biologically relevant, biologically salient, but also working on problems like energy consumption and things like that. So there was some talk of using insect nervous systems as sort of inspiration, and one of the slides in that talk was a slide on neuro-inspired ingredients that are missing. So, we have a number of things that we don't really have in our current models of artificial intelligence, artificial neural networks. One of these is neuromodulation. So we might have a network topology that is, something we don't change. We don't change the weights per se. We don't change the topology. But what we do change is the function. And so it might be that we need to have like a certain set of weights and a secondary set of weights to manage this neuromodulation. And of course, we know that neuromodulation is controlled by hormones, other types of neurochemicals, neuropeptides. So we have this model for doing that. We have the neuropeptidergic connectome for C. elegans as just an example of this sort of thing, where we can actually incorporate neuromodulation into our models. We also have things like rhythms and oscillations, which are not particularly useful for, say, like DNNs or other types of neural networks, but are important for robotics because we're trying to model an output of movement often, or some other behavior that's embodied. And so that's an important part. We also say there's a special role of inhibition. There's recurrence feedback. There are different cell types that need to be modeled. So, not all cells are generic cells. They have different functions. They have different morphologies, etc. There's also non-synaptic signaling and dendritic computation. So those are they stress those two things quite a bit in the workshop. This is the path forward, intentional alignment of AI, neuroscience, and cognitive science. This is actually a nice diagram because it shows kind of how these things kind of overlap. So it's not just NeuroAI now, it's NeuroCog AI. So you have neuroscience where you have neural data as the contribution. You have structural priors, which come from cognitive science. And then you have your DNN models, which come from AI. So you have this overlap where you have neural data informing DNN models, but then cognitive science provides your structural priors. And together you can build, a nice set of models. So I think that's interesting. They included cognitive science in here. And, it's interesting that they think of this as this sort of intentional alignment. So this is Blake Richards' talk. I talked about Blake Richards' take on this before. He talks about NeuroAI as being this general science of intelligence, founded on parallel distributed systems, control, and learning. And then he makes this other statement. Rather than continue the battle in cognitive science, we have dropped the endless philosophical debates and grandiose ideas and focused on a progressive research program of science and engineering because that is what's paid off for us in the end. And he makes this other kind of appeal, kind of about cybernetics and connectionism, which we talked about. He does mention that, we have to think about it in terms of cybernetics and connectionism, I think, which are kind of the two main insights. We don't talk about very much in NeuroAI. But then in their original form, cybernetics and connectionism oversold and underdelivered. So this is where, cybernetics wanted to be the sort of catch-all methodology for everything from neuroscience to economics. Connectionism was kind of like that too, where they built these connectionist networks and they wanted to solve every problem with it. And so it was oversold and underdelivered. So needless to say, neither of these approaches did that or did the things that they promised. And so that's maybe a lesson for NeuroAI, first of all, but also that it's a lesson for, like what is the legacy of cybernetics and connectionism. And so in the face of these grandiose ideas, the clear arguments made by people like Minsky, Simon, Papert, Chomsky, etc., were more convincing than the weak demonstrations provided by people like Rosenblatt, Wiener, McCullough, etc. This is interesting. He's making this point that sort of the GoFi people, or the good old-fashioned AI people, Minsky, Simon, Papert, Chomsky, they actually were able to sort of build things and put them out into the world and make arguments for intelligence that were much better than the weak demonstrations provided by Rosenblatt, Wiener, McCullough, which are more in the neuroscience camp, or in the perceptron camp, which is kind of in the neuroscience camp. The point is that you have basically the connectionists, the GoFi people, versus the perceptron slash cybernetics people. And he makes this kind of differentiation by saying that the latter had weak demonstrations of their principles, whereas there are clear arguments in the first camp. So maybe that's a bias of an AI researcher, but it's an interesting point to make. Why did cybernetics and connectionism not sort of serve as this foundation, or how much of a foundation did it form? As we talked about last week, people are using, say, like the overhead regulator theorem in various ways. So it's not useless. It's not necessarily. It was a weak demonstration maybe at the time, but maybe not now. So, anyways, I think that's enough for this. It's very interesting. I think it frames a lot of things we've been talking about. It has a lot of, there's a lot to follow up on, but it was a very good workshop, and I recommend watching it on the NIH cast.
Yeah, I got to only see a little bit of the whole thing, and I'm glad this recap. You picked several interesting things to share. So I don't know if I could look at the folder or something, but I'd be curious to see some of the other screenshots and stuff.
Oh yeah, I can share that.
Because there's even in terms of like the data management stuff and the psyops things, like there's something I want to look more into for other like the more project management stuff we're talking about. And on the other end of the spectrum, the cybernetics, NeuroAI stuff, and um, a lot of interesting stuff. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Morgan, I know you want to say something.
Well, I'm wondering what struck you as new there in terms of NeuroAI.
So I thought, like it was interesting because they had like kind of the NeuroAI that maybe like Mila, which was represented by Blake Richards, it talks about, and then there's like the neuromorphic stuff that was kind of like brought in. So there is this kind of intersection there, and it's not even kind of the same thing. They're maybe not the same questions even, but it's interesting that those two things exist. I thought that the Blake Richards stuff on cybernetics was interesting. I thought the embodiment aspect was interesting. I thought that, like the dendritic computing stuff was interesting because I think, when we talk about NeuroAI, we're really talking about abstractions that are better or different from standard AI, where we have our connectionist model of our cells and we just try to optimize the weights. When in fact, there's all sorts of stuff going on in the brain that we could use as inspiration. And, they relate to things like building kind of a physiology because in embodiment, of course, we need a physiology. Ideally, we need to build in like things that relate to like a morphology. So yeah, I think there's a lot there that I think that sort of aspect of it is really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's yeah. I mean, neuromorphic. I mean, yeah, I always like to point out, neuromorphic computing was a part of the Human Brain projects originally. Like
Yeah,
it wasn't. Uh, yeah, but it is good to see. It is good to see there, uh, and it does speak to that. Do you have implementations that actually do things?
yeah,
Uh, uh, it's yeah, yeah. I mean, I would almost want there to have been more robotics.
yeah,
I don't know.
yeah.
I
Well,
mean, I liked what you said though about the oscillations. Like, there's not a lot of use of especially as a kind of data analyst of neuro data. You know, spend a lot of time thinking about oscillations,
yeah,
but they don't have they don't have a big role in neuro AI. But certainly something you think about in terms of yeah, um, like central pattern generators for robotics
yeah,
and that kind of that the, like the forces on the body in terms of soft robotics and
right,
things like that. Like putting the fish in water and seeing putting the dead fish in water and
right.
seeing it sweat. Um,
Yeah,
it's interesting. There was Dennis Noble spoke at Institute of Arts and Ideas or something like that.
okay.
Anyway, but he was doing his normal thing of saying that genetics is all wrong. but uh, but yeah, was asked something about AI and why aren't any of these principles used in AI or something like that. I'm not going to do it justice, but it was funny because he's like, you and I are 70% water.
Yeah, and AI is not.
It's like there's nothing. Yeah. Anyway, and when she said something like, so what if we had a water-based AI? And he was just like, that's life. You
Yeah,
just created life. But it just I mean, I don't know if there was anybody there representing agential matter and and um, a kind of leaven, uh, a kind of greater multi-scale perspective, like leaven
yeah,
in terms of um, I mean, especially in terms of the kind of the things in addition to the kind of multi-scale and things like that, but just like the introspection and some of the things we talked about, like that DARPA is trying to build into robotics, that again, it's just like these things all exist in kind of systems built on agential matter, but
Right.
to build a robot that can assess its own damage and and do something about it, these are all things that you have to hard code in.
Yeah.
Like Darkness common sense challenge, which I still think is hysterical that they've got their their mission icon is the robot sitting on a tree branch sawing off the branch. I still, I still, I still love that that's their actual symbol.